Right on the second day after we moved into our new house, I already felt like there was something a bit off about the place. It was a quiet street, with these attached houses that all looked the same, and it seemed like the kind of neighborhood where people just kept to themselves. But that morning, while I was still unpacking boxes and trying to keep the noise down, I was surprised by a knock at the door. There was a man in his mid-40s, looking tired and kind of scruffy, like he hadn't had a good night's sleep in a while. He gave me a quick smile and said he lived next door, offering to help with the move. It was polite of him, but something about the way he looked at me made me uncomfortable, like he was taking in every little detail. I thanked him and said I had it under control, but he insisted. He kept saying it'd be no trouble at all, and that it was always good to have someone around to lend a hand. I felt awkward, not wanting to be rude, but I turned him down again, trying to make it clear I was fine. He hesitated for a few seconds, staring into the house before giving a strange nod and finally walking off. I felt like I had done something wrong by being firm, but I shook it off and got back to what I was doing, trying to ignore the weird vibe. I figured it was just a weird first impression, but it didn't take long for him to show up again, this time without even knocking, just approaching the door and casually asking if I needed help setting up some furniture. That second visit was even more uncomfortable. He showed up right after lunch, out of nowhere, like he'd been watching for the perfect time to come over. I turned him down again, trying to be polite, but now I was really bothered by how often he was popping up. Still, he stood there for a few minutes, talking about how quiet the house was and how the whole neighborhood had gotten quieter over the years. I started wondering if he had a job at all because he seemed to have all the time in the world to hang around and offer help, even though I clearly wasn't interested. When he finally left, I felt a wave of relief, but for some reason, I just couldn't shake that strange feeling. Over the next few hours, I tried to distract myself with more unpacking, but my mind kept drifting back to him. As the evening rolled around, I closed all the windows and felt relieved seeing my son asleep in his room, finally at peace after the stress of moving. But then, around 9 that night, I heard a faint noise outside. I immediately felt on edge, so I went to the living room window, and to my horror, I saw the neighbor standing there in the dark, just staring at my son's bedroom window. My heart was racing, and I just stood there, frozen, not sure what to do. The sight of him standing there, fixated on my son's window, filled me with this deep fear that made it hard to even think straight. He was completely still, staring with this intense focus that was just unsettling. I fought the panic building up inside me and finally gathered the courage to go into my son's room. When I got there, he was still outside, but as soon as he saw me in the window, he simply looked away, gave this strange smile, and waved like everything was perfectly normal. A wave of anger mixed with fear took over, and before I could think it through, I yelled at him to go away and leave us alone. But he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with that unsettling grin. That's when I, feeling desperate and not knowing what else to do, grabbed my phone and called the police. I tried to explain the situation, but I'm pretty sure my voice was shaking. While I was on the phone, he finally walked off, disappearing around the side of the house. But that image of him at the window was burned into my mind. The police showed up pretty quickly, and despite the whole absurd situation, I felt a bit safer seeing the flashing lights on the street. I told them everything, but the real shock came when one of the officers came back and said there was no sign of anyone living in the house next door. I thought they must have misunderstood, so I insisted, explaining how he'd introduced himself as my neighbor and had shown up multiple times that day. I mentioned his offers to help, how he'd just appeared out of nowhere, and then the incident that night. The officers looked at each other, their expressions skeptical, and one of them went to the patrol car to check the address. That's when they told me that the house had been marked as vacant for years, with no one living there. In that moment, it felt like the ground dropped from under me. I asked if they could search the place, but they hesitated, explaining that technically it was private property, and without signs of forced entry, there wasn't much they could do. Still, after seeing how shaken I was, they agreed to check around the yard next door. I stood on my doorstep, watching with a mix of fear and hope. They walked around the property, shone their flashlights into the windows, and even knocked on the door to see if anyone would answer. They didn't find a single thing. No signs of recent movement, no footprints, no hint that anyone had been there. When they came back, they tried to reassure me, suggesting that sometimes people wander into empty properties for whatever reason. But they made it clear that, officially, no one was living there, and that I was probably just mistaken or there'd been a misunderstanding. After they left, I sat in the living room for a long time, just staring at the wall, trying to make sense of it all. The idea that I might have imagined it didn't make any sense. I knew what I'd seen. I knew that man had been there, persistent and strange, ever since that morning. The image of him standing by my son's window kept replaying in my mind, making my skin crawl every time. I tried convincing myself that the cops were right, that maybe it was just some stranger messing around. But nothing about that explanation felt real. The worst part was the feeling of insecurity. I just moved here, hoping for a fresh start in a quiet place, and now I couldn't feel safe in my own home. Even after trying to let it go, I couldn't sleep that night. I went into my son's room several times, just to make sure he was okay, and every little noise seemed to make my anxiety spike. When dawn finally came, a small part of me hoped it was over, but that sense of being watched wouldn't leave me. The next morning, I stepped out into the yard and looked over at the house next door, hoping to spot something, anything, that could explain what happened. But it was completely lifeless, with no sign that anyone had been there. The windows were dusty, the yard overgrown, and everything about it looked abandoned. But still, his presence felt like it was lingering, as if he was just waiting for another chance to show up. Throughout the day, I tried to keep things normal and ignore the unease, but my mind kept drifting back to that face at the window. I even took my son out for a walk, trying to get some fresh air and clear my head. But coming back, that uneasy feeling hit me again, stronger than ever. I noticed a piece of cloth, or maybe an old jacket, on the porch of the house next door, and my immediate reaction was a mix of anger and fear. It felt like he'd left it there on purpose, like a reminder that he wasn't really gone. My heart raced, and I rushed us back inside, locking the door and closing all the windows, trying to convince myself that we were safe. And then, that night, it all stopped. There were no more strange sounds, no more knocks, and no more sightings of him. It was like he had just vanished, leaving behind nothing but the fear he'd stirred up. But even though he never showed up again, that feeling of being watched still haunts me. To this day, every time I close the blinds at night, I can't shake the thought that he might still be out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to come back. When Carlos and I rented that small house off campus, it felt like the perfect place. Cozy, quiet, affordable, and close enough to both classes and work. On the first day, we were busy setting things up, exploring the rooms, and already planning to have some friends over soon. The place had this musty smell, like it had been shut up for a while, but we shrugged it off as just part of the new beginning vibe. But then, while we were still unpacking, the phone rang. I thought it was odd since we hadn't given our number to anyone yet, but I answered, figuring it might be the landlord or some utility company. Instead, a calm, almost eerie voice just wished us a nice stay and hung up. No name, no explanation, nothing. I told Carlos, and he laughed, thinking it was probably a prank from someone who knew the house had new tenants. I tried to laugh it off too, but that voice stuck with me, echoing in my mind. Over the next few days, something else strange started happening. Every time I left or came back from campus, there was someone standing at the corner of our street, always in the same spot, facing our house. At first, I told myself it was just someone waiting for a bus or maybe a ride. But after a while, it became clear this wasn't random. The same figure, just standing there, barely moving, always staring in the direction of our house. When I mentioned it to Carlos, he looked, shrugged, and said it was probably just someone from the neighborhood. I tried to believe that too, but each time I caught that person watching us, A chill ran down my spine, like I was being sized up in some way I couldn't explain. Then one evening, coming back from work, I noticed our front gate was unlocked. It wasn't just a feeling. I knew we'd locked it before we left. I looked around, but nothing seemed out of place, so I called Carlos over and joked that maybe some neighborhood kid was messing with us. He laughed it off, saying that's probably all it was, but something about it nagged at me. If it was a prank, wouldn't someone else in the neighborhood have noticed by now? After that, I started paying more attention, just to make sure I wasn't being paranoid. I didn't want to seem jumpy, but deep down, part of me wondered if this was the start of something worse. That night, we decided to shake off the weirdness and make dinner, trying to laugh it all off. But as we were eating and chatting, we heard a sound coming from the hallway. We froze, holding our breath. It was faint, like soft footsteps, but it was unmistakable. We glanced at each other, and the first thought that hit me was that someone had definitely broken in. I didn't think twice. I went straight to the kitchen, grabbed the first knife I could find, and Carlos did the same. We stood there, silent, straining to hear anything more. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling that someone was there didn't. This wasn't in our heads. Someone was actually in the house with us. We stood there for what felt like forever before deciding to move toward the bedroom, where the sounds seemed to have come from. Every step we took felt louder than the last, and my hand was so sweaty I had to grip the knife tight so it wouldn't slip. When we got close to the bedroom door, I noticed it was slightly open, just enough to see the darkness inside. By then, fear had turned every shadow into something threatening. I took a deep breath, then nudged the door open. The room was a total mess. Drawers yanked open, clothes all over the floor, and even the bed we'd made that morning was messed up. The mattress shifted like someone had dug through it. Then, suddenly, we heard the sound of a window sliding open. We rushed into the room and, for a split second, saw a figure jumping out the window, disappearing into the dark outside. My heart was racing. Carlos and I just stood there, not knowing whether to chase after him or search the rest of the house for anyone else hiding. For those next few minutes, we just stayed silent, listening to our own hearts pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was terrifying to think that some stranger, someone we didn't know at all, had been in our house, going through our stuff, and then bolted right in front of us. And the scariest part was, he'd run because he knew we were there. Once the shock wore off a little, we called the police. They arrived pretty fast, and after a sweep of the house and the area outside, they couldn't find anyone. One of the officers noticed how shaken we were and asked if anything strange had happened recently. I told him about the guy on the corner and the weird phone call we'd gotten on our first day, and he got this serious look on his face. He advised us to stay alert, lock all windows and doors, and just be cautious. That night, the house felt colder and quieter than ever. Every little noise that I wouldn't normally notice now felt like a threat, and every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that ransacked bedroom over and over again. The next day, when we went back into the room to clean up the mess, we noticed something we'd missed in the chaos. On the corner desk where we usually kept our school papers, there was a folded piece of paper that didn't belong to us. We unfolded it, and my stomach dropped when I realized what it was: a list. It was a rundown of our schedules, every detail of when we usually left, came back, and the days we worked late. Just knowing someone had been watching us, keeping track of our routines without us having a clue, made me feel sick. Whoever this person was, they'd been watching us for days. After finding that list, it felt like everything we thought was normal had turned creepy and threatening. Every little sound, every shadow outside the window felt like it was hiding someone watching us. In the following days, I realized just how easy we'd made it for whoever was tracking us. We had set routines, predictable habits, and didn't think twice about leaving a window cracked or the back door unlocked for some fresh air. Just the thought that, at some point, that intruder had been inside, hidden and planning, made me question every moment I'd spent in that house, thinking I was safe. From then on, any sense of security Carlos and I had was totally gone. We decided to move out as soon as we could, but until then, we took every precaution we could think of. We locked every single door and window and tried leaving and coming back at different times to throw off anyone who might still be keeping an eye on us. But the worst part was that, even with all of that, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The figure on the corner wasn't there anymore, but the paranoia had taken root, and there was no ignoring it. We couldn't relax in that house again, and I knew that until we left, there would be no real peace. A few days later, we finally moved out, not looking back. The landlord tried to talk us into staying, saying it was all probably a coincidence, that things like this could happen anywhere. But honestly, even he didn't seem convinced by his own words. After everything that had happened, we just wanted to leave it all behind. For the first few days after, we were both still paranoid, constantly checking if anyone was following us and being extra careful with our routines. Even now, when I think about that ransacked bedroom and that list of our schedules, I get chills. There's a vulnerability that's hard to shake, like we'd been violated in a way that no lock could protect us from. To this day, the question that haunts me is, who was that person? And why were they tracking us? We never got answers, and the police eventually dropped the case for lack of evidence. But even though time has passed, that feeling of being watched and followed hasn't completely left. Sometimes, I find myself looking over my shoulder, just to make sure no one's there, watching. It's like that house wasn't just a place we lived, but the start of a paranoia I'm not sure I'll ever fully shake. As they say, the real fear isn't what we can see, but what we feel is there, even when no one else believes it. When we moved into that house in the countryside, my husband and I were excited and even a bit relieved. It was a simple place, but it was all we could afford, and it was close to the farms where we found work. On our first day there, as we were unpacking boxes and furniture, we met our neighbors, an older couple who lived on the property next door. They seemed friendly, with those warm, welcoming smiles you only get from folks in rural areas, like they genuinely wanted us to feel at home. They invited us over for dinner that night, and we accepted. We talked about the crops, about farm life, and the slow-paced countryside routine. But by the end of the night, they gave us one strange piece of advice. Never go outside after midnight. I found it kind of funny, like a typical village story, some local superstition. My husband laughed it off too, but the older couple looked dead serious, almost anxious, like this was more than just some casual warning. At first, we didn't think much of it. We figured it was just some local legend, something they told newcomers to add a little mystery to country life. After a few days, we settled into our routine and got used to the silence out there. Everything seemed so peaceful, and we even forgot about the neighbors' advice. One night, we were sitting outside on the porch steps, admiring the stars. The moonlight was so bright, it lit up the whole field, and it felt like the perfect night to just unwind. That's when my husband pointed to something in the distance, near the edge of the field. There was a person standing there, alone, just staring at our house. I couldn't see their face, but a weird, uncomfortable chill ran down my spine. My husband suggested we head inside, and although I hesitated, I agreed. We figured it might be someone from around, maybe just curious about the new people in the area, but the feeling was too eerie to ignore. The following nights, we tried to keep to our usual routine, but we were both more alert, watching for any movement outside. To be honest, I couldn't shake that image of the figure from my mind. We didn't know who it was, but something about them just felt off. I kept trying to tell myself I was overreacting, that maybe it was all in my head. But 3 nights later, while we were closing up the windows, there they were again. Same spot, standing perfectly still, just watching the house. This time, they seemed even closer. It was impossible to make out any details, but there was something in the way they stood there that made my stomach churn. My husband joked that it was probably just a local or someone who'd lost their way, but neither of us could fully relax. The next day, we decided to mention it to our elderly neighbors, hoping they'd have some kind of explanation that would put our minds at ease. They listened carefully, but when we brought up the figure in the field, Their expressions changed instantly. They looked uneasy, almost as if they knew exactly what we were talking about but didn't want to get into it. When we pressed them, the old man just looked away and repeated his advice to avoid going outside at night. We couldn't get anything else out of them, and the tension just kept building. That's when I noticed that, no matter how warm the night was, their curtains were always shut tight once the sun went down. It left me with a feeling that they were hiding something, but it was like they'd rather not remember whatever it was. That night, we decided to close all the windows and lock ourselves in before it even got fully dark. I kept trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but the fear was hard to ignore. Once it was completely dark, we stayed close to the window with the lights off, watching the field in silence, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the figure wouldn't show up again. But right on cue, there it was, standing in the exact same spot, not moving, like a statue. In the moonlight, it looked even stranger, like a shadow without features, just a vague outline of a person. My stomach turned as I watched, knowing it wouldn't budge, almost like it was just there to be seen, reminding us of its presence. The next morning, we went out to the field, hoping to find some proof that someone had actually been there. Footprints, a path, anything to show we weren't imagining it. But the field was untouched, no signs of anyone having stood there. That just added to the tension, and my husband suggested we stop looking outside at night, to let it go. But I couldn't help it. Every night, I felt this weird pull to check, like I had to see for myself. And every single night, it was there. Same spot, same time. As the nights went by, the fear was getting unbearable. Even when I tried to avoid looking, I could feel that presence outside, almost like it was watching us even if we didn't watch back. My husband eventually started ignoring it, trying to pretend it wasn't happening, but I knew he felt the same unease. Until one night, after a short rainstorm, I looked out and saw it again. Only this time, it was closer, almost halfway across the field. I felt my heart race, and the thought of it getting any nearer on the following nights filled me with dread. The next day, out of pure desperation, I went back to our neighbor's house, practically begging them to tell us what was going on. I knocked on their door, and the old lady answered, looking almost sad. When I mentioned how the figure had moved closer, she just shook her head and muttered, "Some things are better left where they are." And with that, she closed the door. That night, the fear felt different, almost like something heavy pressing down on us, telling us to give up and just ignore it all. But the curiosity and dread were too strong. I tried to stay away from the window, but eventually, I found myself peeking through the curtains. There it was again, and this time, it was even closer, right at the edge of our property. I could almost make out the shape of a face, though it was blurry and shadowed, like there was no real expression there. Just emptiness where eyes should have been. I felt frozen in place, unable to look away, like its gaze, or whatever it was, had me trapped. That night, I barely slept. The silence in the house felt thick and unsettling, like even the walls were closing in on us, amplifying every tiny noise. When morning finally came, I thought the daylight would break the tension, make everything seem normal again. But when we talked, it was clear we were both exhausted and on edge. My husband suggested we think about leaving, and for a moment, I felt a bit of relief. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it might not let us go that easily. The next night, we agreed not to look, to stay in our room with the doors and windows locked tight. But even though I wasn't looking, I could feel it out there, like its presence was reaching through the walls, watching us. Every little creak or movement made me jump, and I was sure I heard faint footsteps on the porch. My husband squeezed my hand, and we stayed silent, both of us just waiting for the night to pass. The footsteps eventually faded, and everything went back to a heavy, unsettling quiet. When the sun finally rose, we didn't waste any time. Without saying much, we knew it was time to leave. The fear was just too much to bear. We packed up as quickly as we could and left that place. And to this day, neither of us has any idea what was out there in that field. All I know is, Some nights, I still get that same uneasy feeling, like something's out there, just watching. When I moved into this house, I was excited about finally being a short walk from my job. As a teacher in a small town, I always ended up spending way too much time commuting, so finding this place felt like a real stroke of luck. The house was small, old, but it had this charm, that kind of simplicity you only find in older homes. But on the first night, as I was settling in and trying to get used to the new sounds, I heard something strange coming from the heating system. At first, I thought it was just some regular creaks and groans that old houses make. But after a few minutes, I started to realize the noise wasn't what I expected. Instead of creaks, it sounded like whispers. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was just tired from the move. But the noise wouldn't stop. It was like someone was trying to speak from inside the vents, whispering. Now and then, I could almost make out words, but what really got under my skin was when I heard something that sounded like my own name. It was this quiet, choked Anna. That's when my mind started racing, but at the same time, I was trying to brush it off. Maybe it was just the wind, or some loose part rattling. The next day, I tried to shake it off, but the sound was still bugging me. After my classes, I decided to mention it to the landlord. He's this friendly old guy, always polite, so I thought he might help figure out if there was something wrong with the heating system. When I told him about the whispers, he laughed it off, saying that old houses have character and make all kinds of noises. He assured me the heating had been checked recently, so it couldn't be anything more than normal sounds. But I knew what I'd heard. That wasn't just pipes or ducts settling. That night, I went back to the house with a nagging feeling. I tried to ignore the noise, distracting myself with music on my phone, even reading a book. But every time it got quiet, the whispers were back. I started focusing more, trying to make sense of what these voices were saying, like they were broken up bits of conversations someone had left behind. And the creepiest part? It was like the voice was calling my name, over and over. That night, I felt this tightness in my chest that wouldn't go away. You know when you just know something's wrong, but you can't put your finger on it? I got out of bed a few times, walking around the house, trying to see if the noise was coming from outside, but everything was dead quiet except for the heating system. What freaked me out most was how the sound would start, stop, and then start up again. I spent over an hour like that, trying to brush it off, but the whispers just kept getting clearer. At one point, I swear I heard someone say, "I'm watching you." That simple phrase, coming out of a heating vent, sent chills down my spine. It was ridiculous. I knew that, but I couldn't think of any other explanation. That's when I decided to check things out. I grabbed a flashlight and started looking at the vents around the house, starting with the one in the living room. I put my ear right up against it, and this wave of dread hit me when I realized the sound was actually coming from inside. It was like someone was there, right on the other side, speaking into the vent. With my heart pounding, I went to the next vent, the one in the hallway between the living room and my bedroom. When I crouched down to look closer, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tiny holes around the edges of the vent cover. They were small, almost unnoticeable, and kind of rough, like someone had made them by hand. That gave me this sick feeling in my stomach. Why would anyone put holes around a vent cover? And worse, for what reason? I stared at those holes, trying to figure out what they meant, but at the same time, feeling this wave of panic building up. The only explanation that came to mind was terrifying and bizarre. Someone was watching through those holes. I felt like there were 1,000 eyes on me at that moment, even though I couldn't see anyone. The fear froze me, and for a few seconds, I just stayed there, flashlight shaking in my hand. The feeling of being watched was so overwhelming that I almost regretted even looking. The whispers now felt like they had a purpose, as if they were either trying to warn me or mess with my head. I couldn't hold back anymore. I had to check the attic. The thought terrified me, but I needed to know what was going on in this house. I grabbed a chair to reach the attic opening and, with shaking hands, pushed the hatch up. When I shined my flashlight around, I felt a chill run through me. The attic was dusty and full of cobwebs, but what really caught my attention were the marks on the floor, like something heavy had been dragged across it. Then I saw something even worse: empty food wrappers and an old, crumpled blanket in one corner. It was a clear sign that someone had been up there recently, maybe even living there. My mind raced with questions and horrifying thoughts. Was it a former tenant? Or someone who knew the house well enough to sneak in and stay hidden? And the holes in the vent covers, it all made sense now. That person had been using the ventilation system to watch me. Panic took over, and all I could think about was getting out of the house as fast as possible. I climbed down from the attic, almost tripping over myself, and headed straight for the front door. But in my panic, I realized I'd left my phone in the bedroom. I was terrified to go back in there, but I knew I needed it to call someone. Maybe the police or the landlord. With my heart racing, I grabbed the flashlight again and walked back to my bedroom, trying not to think about the fact that someone might be watching me at that very moment. As soon as I grabbed my phone, I heard the muffled sound again, closer this time, almost as if it was coming from inside the room. I didn't have the courage to look at the vent. I ran out of the room and called the landlord from the front door, trying to keep my voice steady. I told him everything, from the whispers to the holes and the signs of someone living up in the attic. He was silent for a few seconds, then finally said he'd come by the next day to take a look. At that moment, I couldn't tell if he was clueless or hiding something.